Joshua Maddox. In 2008, Joshua Maddox, then 18, was a typical Coloradoan living in Teller County's Pike National Forest. He loved nature and hiking, so when he left to go on a walk one day, nobody thought anything of it until he failed to return that night. For months after Josh vanished, people conducted searches all throughout the region in the hopes of finding him alive, or at the very least, learning more about his possible whereabouts. He was on the missing persons list for years, nevertheless, and was never located. In an apparently unconnected sequence of events, a builder chose to demolish an old, dilapidated cottage in the woods that had been abandoned for more than 10 years in order to start developing the land it stood on in 2015. The builder entered the cabin for the first time in a long time before it was demolished to make sure everything was in working order. He noted that the cabin smelled strongly of rot and decay, but he put it down to the numerous animals that had taken up residence in the dilapidated structure over the years. However, as the demolition process began, with the chimney being disassembled in order to salvage the bricks, workmen were shocked to find a young man's body inside, which they assumed was the cause of the stench. Joshua Maddox's body was positively identified by his dental records, which the police and coroner used to identify and remove the remains. Given that Maddox was discovered in a fetal posture, with his feet above his head and his legs curled up under his chest, detectives surmised that he may have become stuck while attempting to explore the abandoned building. There are many who disagree with the coroner's estimate, despite the fact that the autopsy revealed no signs of trauma or suspicious chemicals and declared the passing to be accidental. For instance, the heavy breakfast bar that had been forcefully taken from the wall and dragged in front of the chimney to hide it had vanished, as had the heavy metal grate that had covered it. The fact that Joshua willingly went up the chimney head first and that his clothes were discovered folded inside the cottage close to the fireplace further puzzled people. When he'd entered the chimney, all he had on was a light thermal shirt. The authorities never found out what had really happened, and the case is still unsolved. Omar Bin Omran. A scary video captures the moment police found the hiding location of a man who was supposedly taken in 1997 while still a teenager. On his way to vocational school in Algeria, Omar Bin Omran, then 17 years old, disappeared. It wasn't until Sunday, May 12th, that police were able to track him down. Since then, footage of Omran's finding has been aired on Algerian television networks and shared on social media. In the video, Omran, who has grown facial hair, is seen peering up into the torchlight from what looks to be the hay-surrounded pit in the ground. Omran, who is now in his 40s, was discovered in what appears to be a sheep enclosure beneath the floor. Omran was discovered about 300 feet from his own family's home, which added to the discovery's astonishing nature. The 61-year-old man suspected of holding him captive made an attempt to escape after his discovery, but he was apprehended and placed under detention in custody. Omran went missing in 1997 during the height of the Algerian Civil War, and his family thought he had disappeared and believed that they would never see him again. On the other hand, his mother is reported to have maintained hope until her passing in 2013. Following a dispute over inheritance, the brother of Omran's alleged captor, who was reportedly employed as a public servant, suggested on social media that he might have been involved in Omran's disappearance, prompting investigators to reopen the investigation. After searching the man's house, the Algerian National Gendarmerie found the trapdoor concealed behind the hay. A court official discussed the discovery, saying that the National Gendarmerie was ordered to launch an extensive investigation, and officers proceeded to the property in question by the General Prosecutor of the Court of Idrissa in the province of Jelfa, following this complaint. The suspect will be presented to the Public Prosecutor's Office immediately after the investigation is concluded, and the Public Prosecutor's Office ordered that Omran receive medical and psychological treatment. Omran was brought to a hospital when he was found, so he could receive both medical and psychological care. The El Kabar Daily reported that Omran said he could see his family members from a window where he was being held, but that he felt as if there was a strong power inside him, preventing him from calling out. The Vanishing of Timothy Pittman. 2011 saw the disappearance of Timothy Pittman. In Aurora, Illinois, his father dropped him off at school, but shortly after, his mother Amy took him on a 3-day excursion to an amusement park. During this journey, Amy Fry Pittman ended things. She was later discovered in a Rockford, Illinois hotel room. Timothy was supposedly safe with individuals who would take care of him, but the mother said that she would make sure that he would never be seen again. Timothy was the sole child of Amy and James Pittman, born in 2004. That May Day, Amy pretended to have a family emergency when she excused Timothy from class. She then brought her 6-year-old son to the zoo and the Key Lime Cove Resort in Gurney. Following that, on May 13th, they traveled to the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin, where they were last observed on security tape. Since he went to pick up Timothy and was informed that she took him before the school day on May 11th ended, James had been trying to get in touch with his wife out of fear for what was happening with her and their son. Amy Fry Pittman called her mother, brother-in-law, and other family members to confirm that she and Timothy were okay, but she did not return any of James's calls. In the evening, Timothy's mother went to the neighborhood dollar store and bought paper, pens, and envelopes. She took too many antihistamines either that evening or the next morning, which resulted in wrist injuries. On May 14th, she was discovered without Timothy in sight. Tragically, the cops discovered Timothy's blood in considerable amounts inside Amy's automobile. According to a second relative, Timothy frequently suffered from nosebleeds, which may account for the blood traces found in the car. James Pittman clings to the hope and fervent conviction that his son is still alive, somewhere, and still looking for him. Regretfully, there was a scam about his resurrection in 2019. Authorities were notified by Newport, Kentucky residents who reported seeing an adolescent running across the Ohio River Bridge and wandering the streets. When the cops discovered him, he was upset and inconsolable and identified himself as Timothy. The next day, though, the Louisville office declared on Twitter that the boy was not Timothy. Rather, he was Brian Michael Reaney, a 23-year-old who had spent 14 months in jail and had been a resident of Ohio's Belmont Correctional Institution just a month earlier. A spokesperson for the Aurora Police, Sergeant Bill Rowley, said that although they are disappointed that this turned out to be a hoax, they remain diligent in their search for Timothy. Nevertheless, Timothy Pittman has not been located as of yet, and there is no indication as to his current whereabouts. In Mexico, there are 43 missing pupils. On September 26, 2014, 43 students vanished from Iguala, Guerrero, Mexico. After being taken against their will, the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College students disappeared. The case sparked a global uproar that led Guerrero Governor Angel Aguirre Rivero to step down from office. 43 students reportedly traveled to Mexico City as a memorial act for the 1968 Tlatelolco Plaza and a protest against what they perceived to be biased hiring methods for teachers. The students also reportedly traveled on many buses, which the police attempted to stop with firearms and barricades. It's unclear what exactly happened before the students were apprehended, but they were taken by the Mexican criminal syndicate Guerreros Unidos. After having a team of experts look into the matter in 2015, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has questioned the Mexican government's official account of what happened. The experts found after a 6-month investigation that the government's claims were scientifically impossible. The government claims that the students were detained after being misidentified as criminals. José Luis Abarca Velázquez, the mayor of Iguala, and his spouse Maria allegedly planned the disaster while belonging to the Democratic Revolution Party. According to this allegation, the two were against the students interfering with the city's campaign events, and this served as their incentive for committing the crime. They were apprehended in Mexico City for taking out the political activist Arturo Hernández Cardona, but they were neither penalized or tried for the disappearance of the missing students. Felipe Flores, the head of the Iguala police force, was arrested in 2016, along with the mayor and his spouse. 2014 saw the discovery of plastic bags containing remains in a Coquila River. It was believed that these remains belonged to the students who vanished. The University of Innsbruck successfully examined the charred remains of 2 students, while the remaining students are still listed as missing. More than 80 possible suspects were detained as a result of this case. 44 of the 80 suspects were dishonest police officers who were said to have abused their position of trust and authority. Many views exist on what transpired, with some people holding the view that there was a government cover-up. Some say there was involvement from the Mexican army itself. Guerreros Unidos, the primary criminal leader, was formally detained in 2020 on suspicion of being connected to what happened. Founded in 1926, Ayotzinapa College is a male-only institution. There is a history of political activism among the college's students. Students at the college are allegedly well known for taking buses and delivery trucks. Some college students assert that their momentary and routine seizure of trucks and buses, a symbolic act intended solely for protests and returned after usage, therefore not technically stolen, was acceptable. Because they are accustomed to the college's methods of handling protests, the authorities typically ignore this and turn a blind eye. The students claim that this is the only way to get the government to take notice of their protests. Although the college disputes this, authorities think the students may have connections to rival political organizations. It is still unknown today what actually happened to all 48 of the pupils or where their remains are kept. The aforementioned Iguala police chief received a prison sentence in 2021 for his role in what happened to the students. Though there are still too many unanswered questions, reporters and investigators are working to piece together the true events of that September day. It is not every day when a seemingly ordinary 25-year-old vanishes. In 2013, Canadian Army reservist Pradeep Saran disappeared with little clues about what may have happened. Today, it is one of Australia's biggest mysteries. At the time of his disappearance, Saran was studying on the Gold Coast in Australia when he left for a touring holiday, which he planned to finish off in Melbourne. Of all the possibilities, only one thing is known for sure: he drove a van to Charlotte Pass and never returned with it. The New South Wales police called off the search for Saran after only 2 weeks, a decision his family was outraged by. They continued their own investigation into Saran's disappearance by funding private searches. His own cousin and sister flew to the snowy mountains to organise search parties in the hopes of finding out what happened. Unfortunately, Pradeep has never been found. On the day of his disappearance, 4 other hikers set out to make the same journey that Saran had planned just a few hours earlier. The group had run into a blizzard on the trail that made them take shelter in Seaman's Hut, the only shelter on the top of the trail until they began again the next day. The group did not see any sign of Saran. One clue about Saran's disappearance is that on a laptop found in his van, he had been extensively researching Australia's second highest mountain, Mount Townsend. While the trail was far off from the main track, Saran had not been carrying a sleeping bag or tent, meaning if he set out to complete the trail, he had meant to finish it that day. He did not expect anything to ruin his plans. Since his family lived so far away from the location of his disappearance, they had to rely on the help of locals for the search. The family even offered $250 a day to volunteers with a grand prize of $100,000 if Saran had been found, alive or not. This brought many searchers to the area who were hoping to find Saran and earn the reward. According to Sydney man, Dave Jarvis, many searchers were unhelpful and were just in it for the money. Jarvis himself estimated that he spent about 80 days on the search and had actually lost money looking for Saran. Unfortunately, the significant efforts to find Saran did not lead to his discovery, and 2 years after he went missing, the New South Wales Coroner's Court declared Saran loss of life by misadventure. The authorities rejected theories that Saran intended to hurt himself, as all evidence suggested he lived a happy life and had plans for the future. His family still holds on to hope that without a body to confirm his fate, he may still be found alive. As they said in a released statement, miracles do happen. Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a herbicide and defoliant chemical that was used extensively by the US military during the Vietnam War. Its primary purpose was to eliminate forest cover and crops that provided sustenance and concealment to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. However, the use of Agent Orange has left a legacy of environmental destruction and severe health problems that persist to this day. In Southeast Asia, defoliants were first used by Britain as a military strategy. That occurred in Malaya, a British colony, until it gained independence and became Malaysia in the early 1950s. Chemicals were sprayed into the Malayan forests by British bombers in an attempt to take down trees and deny cover to communist rebels. Additionally, they destroyed the insurgents' food supply, which included crops. A decade later, in the then South Vietnam, American military troops used many of the same tactics in their protracted war against militants from the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. An area of South Vietnam roughly the size of Massachusetts was treated with 20 million gallons of herbicide by American delivery planes between 1962 and 1971. This operation, which went by the code name Ranch Hand, peaked between 1967 and 1969. Over the years, a number of series have revisited the significant historical event. Agent Orange, a combination of two herbicides, one of which turned out to be contaminated with a very dangerous strain of dioxin, it was named for the color of a stripe that girdled the barrels in which it was shipped. Executives from chemical companies and Washington bureaucracy argued at the time that there was no cause for fear. They claimed that Agent Orange did not damage people. Those promises began to sound increasingly vacuous as the 1960s went on. In lab animals, researchers discovered indications of birth abnormalities. Scientists from the United States and other countries started to protest the spraying. Protests against the war itself gained traction alongside a growing opposition to the herbicide campaign. The last Agent Orange spraying was done in 1970. Up until January 7, 1971, when the entire herbicide program was abandoned following a final ranch hand run, other chemicals were still being employed. However, Agent Orange's impact was just getting started. Even after 50 years, its influence is still rather strong. Vietnamese people take it practically as gospel that hundreds of thousands of their children suffer from serious birth deformities as a result of American aerial and ground spraying, which they believe contaminated their environment and may have done so for decades to come. There isn't enough evidence to say for sure whether that is true. However, in recent years, the US has reluctantly acknowledged its role in helping to clean up hotspots for dioxin, such as former US military installations that housed herbicides. At the former Da Nang Air Base, a facility constructed in the United States began operations last month. Heats above 600 degrees Fahrenheit will be applied there to dioxin-contaminated soil, which is thought to render the toxin harmless. It is intended that this approach be expanded over time to include additional hotspots. For many of the 2.8 million servicemen and women who served in Vietnam, the conflict is still ongoing here at home. These suffering veterans believe that their exposure to Agent Orange caused their skin problems, malignancies, neurological disorders, and congenital maladies that affect some of their children. Frequently, the connection has not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Research on the impacts of Agent Orange frequently employs wording that is not quite definitive. For example, several ailments are reported to be associated with exposure to dioxin, or a presumptive relationship exists. Nevertheless, over time, the US government's opposition to making any kind of connection between the dots has faded. A suspected connection to diseases like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, soft tissue sarcoma, and chloroquine was acknowledged by the Agent Orange Act of 1991. Veterans suffering from those conditions were granted medical care and financial support without requiring them to provide evidence of their exposure to herbicides. Prostate cancer and Hodgkin's disease were among the more than a dozen other illnesses that were gradually added to this list throughout time. Nor is the story finished. Some veterans, such as sailors who served on ships off the coast of Vietnam and airmen who worked on potentially contaminated military aircrafts that were used for other purposes after the war, are suing for compensation for their physical hardships despite never having set foot on Vietnamese soil. From 1968 to 1970, Admiral Zumwalt oversaw US naval troops in Vietnam before taking on the role of head of naval operations. He gave the order to spray Agent Orange. Around the same time as his father, the son was in Vietnam leading a Navy patrol boat. Doctors discovered years later that he had both Hodgkin's disease and lymphoma. At 42, he passed away in 1988. Elmo IV, his son, was born with congenital abnormalities. Waterloo soldiers were ground up to fertilizer. Thousands of individuals and the unavoidable remnants of war covered the battlefield after Napoleon's famous loss at Waterloo in 1815. However, what became of all those lifeless individuals? The site has produced only one complete skeleton, which has puzzled researchers. According to modern accounts, some French remains were thrown into mass mounds, while others were burned by nearby villagers. Additionally, other stories explain how bones that were strewn were gathered and crushed into meal for use as fertilizer. Tony Pollard, head of the University of Glasgow's Centre for Battlefield Archaeology, is especially intrigued by the last allegation. In an attempt to identify the locations of the missing mound sites on the battlefield at Waterloo, he has studied historical source materials, such as early visitors' memoirs and notebooks and artwork. In a recent publication that was published in the Journal of Conflict Archaeology, he gave an update on his work to date. Napoleon was first overthrown and removed from power as France's emperor in 1814, and he was banished to the Mediterranean island of Elba. For a brief period in March 1815, now known as the 100 Days, he came back to power. The Seventh Coalition was made up of several states that opposed his rule, including a bigger Prussian army commanded by Field Marshal von Blücher and a multinational army under the British commander, the Duke of Wellington. At Waterloo, those were the armies that faced up against Napoleon's Armée du Nord. Although the exact start time of the fight is still up for debate, Wellington's reports from June 18th suggest that Napoleon commenced a furious attack upon the post at Hougoumont at around 10 in the morning. This was one of the major places on the battlefield at Waterloo, a big country mansion partially hidden by trees. For 8 hours, there was ceaseless combat at several locations. Ultimately, Wellington's forces lost about 15,000, compared to 7,000 for Blücher's soldiers. The situation for Napoleon's army was worse. Between 24,000 and 26,000 men lost their lives or were injured, with many more being taken prisoner. Over the following days, 15,000 more French soldiers deserted. This resulted in an enormous cleanup job. According to one modern report, on June 22nd, the battlefield was a sight too horrible to behold. It was written by Major Fry. Fry recalled the multitude of individuals, the heaps of wounded men with mangled limbs unable to move and perishing from not having their wounds dressed or from hunger. Following the soldiers' removal of weapons, clothing and other goods from the soldiers, residents and visitors scurried to recover as many mementos as they could: hats, leather fragments, grape-shot rounds, letters, book pages, and, in one case, a genuine Waterloo thumb nail. Some extracted the deceased's teeth with pliers, so they could be sold abroad to make denture replacements. Waterloo teeth were extremely valuable because they originated from young, healthy men who had lost their lives in battle. Following their stripping, fallen soldiers' bodies were usually burned, buried, or allowed to break down naturally during the Napoleonic Wars, with scavengers like wolves and vultures hastening the process. There are tidings that local peasants were employed to clean up after Waterloo, burying allies in mass mounds and pits and setting French soldiers ablaze. A Hougoumont visitor saw pyres in flames that were fed solely by human fat. There was a heap of thighs, arms and legs, and about 50 labourers were using long forks to rake the flames and the bones while wearing handkerchiefs over their noses. Pollard's investigation focused on reports of visible bone collection and grinding for fertilizer. He has identified the locations of 3 mass mounds that were reported by visitors to have as many as 13,000 individuals. He believes that many of the fallen soldiers were buried in these mounds, which may have had thousands of individuals. Additionally, Pollard discovered at least 3 newspaper articles from the era that detailed the custom of stealing human remains and selling them for fertilizer. For example, the London Observer reported in 1822 that more than 1 million bushels of human and inhuman bones had been brought into the port city of Hull, United Kingdom, from Europe. On the basis of these accounts, backed up by the well-attested importance of bone meal in the practice of agriculture, the emptying of mass mounds at Waterloo in order to obtain bones seems feasible and the likely conclusion. Given that they would have known the locations, locals may have pointed vendors of bones towards the mass mound sites. They might have even contributed to the excavation. Nevertheless, at the Hougoumont site, Pollard's hypothesis has only been supported by circumstantial archaeological evidence, and conclusive historical source analysis is needed to reach a conclusion regarding the claim's validity. In order to reconcile the locations of sites with those recorded in the historical source materials, Pollard feels that more fieldwork is necessary. The Waterloo Uncovered Charity, where Pollard is the archaeological director, will carry out an extensive geophysical survey beyond Hougoumont into larger tracts of the battlefield. This pivotal battle, involving the armies of Britain, Prussia, and their allies against Napoleon's French forces, had profound and lasting effects on European politics, society, and the course of history. The aftermath of Waterloo reshaped the European continent, established new political orders, and influenced the modern world in numerous ways. The Battle of Waterloo brought about a significant reconfiguration of the European political landscape. Napoleon's defeat ended over 2 decades of continuous warfare that had engulfed Europe and led to the restoration of monarchies and the re-establishment of a conservative order. The Battle of Waterloo also had profound implications for military strategies and tactics. The lessons learned from this battle influenced military thought and practices for generations. Napoleon's defeat highlighted the limitations of his military strategies, which had relied heavily on rapid maneuvers, massed artillery, and the shock value of cavalry charges. The Allied victory at Waterloo demonstrated the effectiveness of defensive tactics, disciplined infantry formations, and coordinated coalition warfare. This led to a gradual decline in the use of Napoleonic tactics and a shift towards more modern forms of warfare. Waterloo underscored the importance of coalition warfare, where multiple nations combine their military resources and strategic planning to achieve a common objective. The success of the British and Prussian alliance against Napoleon set a precedent for future military coalitions and alliances, shaping the way wars were fought in the 19th and 20th centuries. The economic landscape of Europe also changed significantly after the Battle of Waterloo. The end of the Napoleonic Wars allowed for economic recovery and growth, but it also presented challenges. The prolonged wars had devastated European economies, disrupting trade, depleting resources, and causing widespread destruction. The end of the Napoleonic Wars opened the door for economic recovery and the resumption of international trade. Countries began to rebuild their economies, restore infrastructure, and re-establish trade relationships, leading to a period of economic growth and industrialization. The battle also marked a turning point in financial stability. Britain's financial strategies during the war, including the establishment of the gold standard and the use of government bonds, set a precedent for modern financial systems. The post-war period saw the stabilization of European currencies and the development of financial institutions that facilitated economic stability and growth. The aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo influenced cultural and intellectual movements, shaping the way people thought about war, society, and politics. The Battle of Waterloo was a watershed moment that brought an end to the Napoleonic Wars and ushered in significant changes across Europe and the world. Politically, it led to the restoration of monarchies and the establishment of a new European order through the Congress of Vienna. Militarily, it influenced the evolution of warfare and the decline of Napoleonic tactics. Economically, it paved the way for recovery and the stabilization of financial systems. Culturally, it inspired movements like Romanticism and nationalism, shaping the intellectual and social landscape of the 19th century.